So I want to talk next about a case study in Baltimore and the Chesapeake Bay area and how they wanted to increase their urban tree canopy and some of the ways in which they are trying to do that. So whoops, I don't have my pointer here. Okay, so there was an urban research project in the Chesapeake Bay area, and they wanted to they were doing a study. They wanted to understand, do riparian patches have similar functions in urban settings? And if you're not familiar, a riparian area is usually considered to be sort of a forested area that's next to a body of water, usually some river type body of water. And so a riparian area is sort of that buffer zone in between the where the water is and then where whatever type of land starts next. But it's sort of just this buffer around the body of water. It's called a riparian patch, and it can these patches usually have functions of like removing pollutants and filtering water and things like that. So they wanted to understand, do riparian patches have similar functions in urban settings? And they found that they don't. And for the reason of that, so the reasons that they don't are sort of this process here where the the installation of stormwater infrastructure alters the hydrologic connectivity. So the channels of water and how water is moving around is being altered by us inputting these stormwater infrastructure, which it shouldn't be surprising because the stormwater infrastructure is designed to do exactly that. We want to move the water into different areas because we don't want it flooding our neighborhoods, or we don't want it getting into our drinking water and things like that. So we're moving water around, and so that literally is going to cause connectivity changes to the hydrologic cycle, and it can cause these things called hydrologic drought, which we're not going to get too much into, but can ultimately result in decreased denitrification. So what you can think of this is as a buildup of nitrogen in terrestrial and sometimes even aquatic systems, because it's not being removed by those riparian patches because of the way the hydraulic structure is functioning. It's not super important that we understand this full process. I just wanted to outline that basically they found that riparian patches were not functioning the same way in urban settings as they do in their natural settings. And so if you have this goal of improving your water quality and reducing stormwater, then planting these riparian zones may not be the best way to do it. So that the Chesapeake Bay decided instead that they were going to focus on establishing a broader tree canopy goal throughout the cities and neighborhoods in the region so that they could slow and reduce stormwater flow that way. So instead of just putting them around the bodies of water, we're going to say we're just going to have a broad goal of increasing tree canopy throughout these areas. And in that way, the trees will reduce the overall stormwater flow rather than trying to target specific areas. And so it's a broader goal, and we're going to say, okay, we're just going to plant more trees and increase the tree canopy everywhere. And so to do that, the city of Baltimore joined this sort of goal where they're going to say, okay, we're going to join your program and increase our tree canopy. And so to do this, the city needed to know some things. So they needed to know, where are the trees right now? How much tree canopy is there right now? Where can we plant new trees? So where's the potential for increasing the urban tree canopy? And then who owns the land where trees are planted and where trees could be planted? Because that's going to make a big difference in terms of how much you can increase your urban tree canopy, and there's different dynamics, and can you plant a tree here or can't you plant a tree in certain spots? So who owns the land is another important one. And they did this through remote sensing. So they used remote sensing to basically collect really highly resolute spatial data at the parcel level so that they could classify individual parcels and then use that to classify patches, and they can create these patches that we've seen and classify as, existing tree canopy or non-existent but potential, or there's no trees here and we can't plant any trees here, and so forth. And what they found when they quantified their urban tree canopy, and I'm sorry if I didn't say this, UTC is just a common abbreviation for urban tree canopy. So if you see UTC, it means urban tree canopy. So they were quantifying their urban forest in Baltimore using that spatial data. And what they found was that their existing tree canopy that they had was about 20%. So 20% of the entire land cover was tree canopy. If they looked at specific patches within the city, then there was a lot of variation. So some patches had 1% tree canopy, some patches had as high as 85% urban tree canopy in their patches. So there's a lot of variation. If you average all of them, then you get to 20%. And what they also found is that of the 20%, 80% of those trees were on private property. So that's a little bit tricky to think about. But of the existing canopy, of all the property where the land cover was trees, 80% of that was on private land, which is important. And so then they also quantified the potential. And so these are areas where they could plant trees, but there are not currently trees. And what they found was there was, again, a lot of variation in the patches. There was anywhere from 29 to 97% variation, and 85% of this area was on private property. And so that really limits their potential for urban tree canopy growth, because if you're a city government and you want to plant trees, you can only really plant trees on public property that's owned by the government, the local government. And so, you can't just walk into someone's backyard and say, hey, we're going to plant a tree here, because, that you just can't do that. That's private property. And so you can plant trees in all the all the public places, but that's not very much of the land, what we're seeing. And so if you want to meet your goals, you're going to have to convince residential private property landowners to do it. And so they created this goal of actually 40%. So they wanted their urban forest to be land cover to be 40%, and it was currently at 20%. So they had to double it. And this number was chosen because there's some evidence that shows anything below 40%, and you start to see reductions in the ecosystem services. And we'll talk about that later on. But if you want trees specifically, in this case, to reduce stormwater flow, or whether it's pollution, air pollution, or urban heat island mitigation, or whatever it is, anything below 40%, and you see a big drop off in the benefits that you're getting. So their goal was to at least get to the minimum here. Now, I should say that, if you're at 20%, doubling it, that's a lot. That's a lot of work. Trees, for one, you plant a tree, it's only a fraction of the size it's going to be, but it takes a long time to get there, and it's difficult to plant that many trees. And so really that's what we're going to talk about here is, how do you get to this goal of 40%, or how did the city of Baltimore decide to get to this goal of 40%? And what we've already seen, they already knew residential patches were going to be needed to achieve that goal. And so they required a better understanding of the social factors that predict variations in existing tree canopy. So what are the social factors that influence the distribution of your tree canopy if you know that residential patches and private property is playing such a large role, then what are some of the patterns that dictate how that private property is influencing your tree canopy? That's what they wanted to know. And it leads us to this idea of the ecology of prestige. Now, it's not a complex idea. It's kind of a multi-layered idea. And so the ecology of prestige is that, to simplify it, people use their home and their yard as sort of a canvas to display what's important to them. And that could be lots of different things, but usually it's tied up in things like their social status, their group identity and some hierarchy of where they are. So people might plant certain types of trees and might have certain types of landscaping styles in order to display to everyone else, who they are, how much, sometimes how much wealth they have, or just what's important to them, environmentally, or whatever it is. There's lots of stuff that goes into it, but people are basically using the exterior of their home and their yard as this canvas where they can show their social hierarchy, their group identity, and their social status. And again, so people might plant certain types of trees, or maybe they're not planting any trees. Maybe they have certain types of landscaping styles. Maybe they have yards. Maybe they don't have yards. Maybe they have, sort of wildflowers and things, and maybe they're trying to do something environmental and increase biodiversity. In any case, a lot of that is tied into a display that people have. So there's these lifestyle factors that go into how people use their private property. And that's important to understand if you're trying to convince people to plant more trees on their property, or maybe types of trees, or whatever it is. It's important to understand how people are using that property in the first place. And so in Baltimore, they found very similar things where lifestyle factors were found to have better predicted land management than population or socioeconomics, which you would expect population density and socioeconomics to play a role in how much urban tree canopy there is. And it does. And it does in Baltimore. But they found that lifestyle factors actually were better predictions of these things of urban tree canopy than these things were. They also found ecological indicators of neighborhood-based markets. So, if people planted, had certain types of um, land management or land use, like if they had certain types of trees or a certain level of um, tree canopy already, then that was going to indicate how receptive they were to tree planting campaigns. So if you were saying, if the city's like, we're going to do a tree planting campaign, we want everyone to start planting trees. If you're in an area that already has trees, you are more likely to be like, yeah, no, let's plant more trees. So there were these ecological indicators of neighborhood-based markets, and there are also legacy effects from the 1960s that predicted existing tree canopy cover. And so stuff that was going on in the past, decades in the past, was still having an influence of where the tree canopy was dense and where it wasn't dense today. So those were some important findings that they found. So if we look at some of these maps that they created, here we can sort of see like the map version of the ecology of prestige, where you can classify these patches into lifestyle characteristics or classifications, and that corresponds to how much tree canopy cover they have in those patches. And I'm not going to go through all these, but what you can sort of clearly see is that certain types, like if you're in a wealthy, particularly older demographic, then you're more likely to have higher tree canopy. Whereas if you're a someone who's young and probably hasn't accumulated as much wealth yet, then you're living in an area that has less tree canopy. So that's what they were finding there. There's also so there were those legacy effects, but they were from the 60s, but there was also some effects going back even further to sort of the 30s, and when some of these areas were zoned, and this is what's commonly referred to as redlining, where some districts and city zones are zoned in ways that maybe here they're literally called hazardous and declining, and that influences the services that those people have access to. So what was commonly happen is that these get zoned as undesirable places, and so things like lenders, banks and loan lenders were not issuing loans in these areas. Sometimes cities were not planting trees in these areas. There may not be like supermarkets and places to get fresh produce or food in general in these areas. So basically, these people were already disadvantaged, and then they were put at more disadvantages because the city designated these areas that way. They were treated differently than other areas, and those areas corresponded to tree canopy. So areas that were zoned historically as hazardous or declining tended to have much lower tree canopy than areas that were not zoned that way. So there were long-lasting legacy effects that were still influencing Baltimore's urban forest today. And so they learned some stuff about the tree canopy, how it existed, and they wanted to use that information to put trees where they needed to go. And so the results of the stakeholder process, coupled with the city's urban tree canopy goals, indicated the need to better understand the organizational complexity of the city's stewardship networks. And what that means is a stewardship organization is usually in this context any organization that's out there doing tree planting campaigns or tree planting programs. And so usually the city government is one of these, and maybe the only one in smaller cities, but bigger cities have, they'll have nonprofit organizations that are doing tree planting, and maybe you even have large private companies that, want to um, improve their image and want to be seen as a company that cares about the community, so that they'll fund tree planting projects and things like that. So these types of groups would be considered stewardship organizations. And if you want to understand the dynamics of your urban tree canopy, then you need to understand, where are these networks, where are these organizations planting trees? Are they planting trees where they need to go? Are they being as effective as they could be? If one organization is more effective than another one, then what are some of those reasons? Why are they talking to each other? Are they sharing information about where trees need to go and what types of trees need to be planted, and who's going to take care of the trees and things like that? So there's all this sort of complexity that needs to be understood if you want to say, we want to reach this goal, and these stewardship organizations are a really important tool, so we need to maximize that tool. So they wanted to understand, who do stewardship organizations work with and where do they work? And so this is sort of a network analysis, and we're not going to get into this, but what they were finding is that the nonprofit organizations, basically the larger the circle here, the more connected it is to other organizations. So nonprofit organizations were doing a good job of talking to other groups and sharing information, and public agencies were doing an okay job, and they kind of have to because they're the government, and so they're talking to other groups. But for-profit organizations were not doing as good of a job as far as informing the city where they're planting and sharing information and sharing data and things like that. And so that's going to have an influence of are you doing a good job of meeting your goals? If not everyone is on the same page, then you're probably not going to be meeting your goals as well. Another thing is, where were they working? Are they working in areas where it's needed? And so if you remember that map, this was sort of that area where there's really low urban tree canopy, and this is a lot of the more impoverished neighborhoods and legacies of redlining in here, and some of these have really, so what you're seeing is the number of the number of just organizations that are doing tree planting in a given patch. And some of these patches have a lot and they're in high priority areas. Some of them have a lot and they're not really in areas that need it the most. And I think this shows a little bit more. So they tracked some tree plantings from a specific year, actually all the tree plantings from fall 2013, and they mapped those out. And you can see how those correspond to the patches. And they designated these patches in terms of a priority. So high priority would be some of these down here where there's really low urban tree canopy, and it's where they want to improve it. For one, there's the most potential, but those people are not, receiving the benefits from having a dense urban tree canopy because they don't have one. So that's the high priority area, and then they sort of designated them like this. And what you can see is that there's while there's a lot of different groups active in the high priority area, there's not as much planting going on. In fact, it's the least amount of planting is happening in the high priority area. There is a lot going on in sort of these moderate levels, sort of probably up in here and sort of these surrounding areas. And there's less going into the low priority areas, which that's okay. That's a low priority or area, but you really want to see more tree planting going on in the high priority areas. So the trees is sort of a mixed bag. Some of the trees were going where they needed to be. Some of them could be going in better places. And so that's kind of all the data that they collected about this. Now, I want to come back to this because this goal of 40%, and I'm not exactly sure where they're at right now. It takes a long time to improve your urban tree canopy. You have to plant trees and then you have to keep them alive for a long time because the trees have to grow. And so I wanted to come back to this and say, it's an ongoing process, and they collected all of that data so that they could sort of have a roadmap and say, okay, how are we doing, and where can we be doing better, and how do we get to where we want to go? And so that's sort of where they're at now. But I wanted to mention all this as a good case study for sort of combining these things that we've been talking about, and so you can kind of see. Hopefully, after all of the 3 weeks, you can see how patch dynamics is sort of this combination of ecological systems and urban systems. And I think that case study in Baltimore was a really great example of that. So hopefully you've seen why urban forestry and urban ecology specifically is such an interdisciplinary science. So, okay, there's a couple of readings for you to do here. So keep working your way through the module, do those readings, and answer the questions and discussions and stuff. And otherwise, I'll see you next week. Oh, and also go vote. Please go vote. I'll probably tell you again and again and again. Go vote. It is super important. And even if we're talking about urban forestry, so this is an urban forestry class, so I'm assuming you care about those issues. So even if you're not engaged in national politics, at the local level, if you think, or if you agree that having more urban tree canopy and more urban vegetation is going to provide benefits to a lot more people, then voting is something you should care about, because the budgets that determine how much tree planting and how much funding goes into those projects is ultimately determined by a political process. The people who you vote for at the local and even the state level are going to be determining how much money can flow into the things like tree planting and tree maintenance and increasing urban tree canopies. That's ultimately a political process. So it's definitely relevant. I personally don't think there's ever been a more important election, but if you're not engaged in the national stuff, then you should definitely care about the local stuff and voting for politicians who believe and support the things that you also support, whatever that may be. So go vote, please. If you're a U.S. For those of you who are U.S. citizens, take a little bit of time and go vote. I'm pretty sure, I know early voting is going on right now in Indiana, and I think just about every state. So take some time and do that. Okay, I will see you next week.